Morning, everyone. As Phil said, my name is Vish Nandlal. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit today about kind of my perspective on WebRTC. And I'm going to start off a little strangely, so just kind of bear with me because I'm going to make a connection to it in the fullness of time. Just wanted to give you that pre-warning. So I want to talk about a story first at the beginning, just to give you a proxy for how I look at WebRTC. And of course, I'm a Canadian, and when you kind of enter into the US, they always tell you the first thing to open a conversation with Americans is about Kennedy. So when Kennedy challenged America to put a man on the moon back in the early 60s, the prevailing technology at the time was something called TIMs. These were these thermionic integrated micromodules, and you guys might not know what those are because they've since expired. But they're effectively vacuum tubes. You'd take the cathode of this thing and put it against a grid, and you'd haze the whole piece together, and you'd create these little sexy modules, and GE pushed them out of their vacuum lab. But effectively, we all know today that this thing doesn't exist, right? What happened is that the engineering community had a call to action. And I kind of picture them all sitting around their engineering tables with their slide rulers out, and they just kind of suddenly jump up, and I always like to guess at what they might have been doing, and I can only think about what I would have been doing at the time, which is watching Thundercats videos. I have an extensive library, so I imagine that these guys were jumping up, distracted from their Thundercats videos, and said, how can we actually make this technology work in a way that's much more efficient? So they did what all engineers at the time did, because they're all working for the US military, and they wrote a highly classified report. And you wouldn't have expected me to kind of engage in some disruptive journalism, but I've actually unearthed this classified document that's since been declassified that talked about micro-miniature circuits, and particularly talked about solid-state circuits. And of course, that was the dawn of semiconductors, and semiconductors is actually the thing that put us on the moon, and that was great. But what did semiconductors do to the industry? They set up an innovation law that we use today, and that innovation law is something that you're all probably intimately familiar with, being in the computer science industry, and it's Moore's Law. And Moore's Law had this great arc to it, which said that we're actually going to double the capacity of transistors every 18 months, but probably more importantly from an economic perspective, we'd have the cost. And this is something that prevails today, and in fact, even though we think we're hitting the limits, we've got FinFET technologies now that Intel are putting out in their custom fabs, and they're actually moving forward into the nanometer scale types technologies, and they're getting these types of capacities still. And as I think about all this, and now as I tie the dots and kind of make a conclusion on this, I thought to myself, what's the innovation law for communications? We're still very much trapped in what I would consider a 19th century model for telecoms. And certainly, from the industry where I come from, which is, largely the staid telecom providers who pushed out their products into the operator space, it's been pretty slow. We haven't really had the types of innovations in terms of the different types of communication capabilities outside of telephony. And of course, there's been a lot of, I think, fear, uncertainty, and doubt within the community about what is the trajectory for telecoms, in particular communications and voice communications, moving forward. And of course, there's been a lot of folks who've been predicting the demise of the voice industry. But the reality here is that people aren't communicating less. I always like to kind of dip into Clayton Christensen's observation that, in general, we're all in a booming industry. It's our way of looking at the industry that's in decline. And if you look at what I'd say the dimensions of innovation in voice have been versus, let's say, a telephony model, which is a very rigid structure. What we've seen from some of these upstarts, like Skype and Facebook and others who've come to the scene, Viber, they're kind of creating their new walled gardens, but they've been able to innovate at many different scopes of the different session protocols for voice. If you go from phone to phone and telephony, they've moved to an any device to any device model. The etiquette is still very intrusive. I get to decide when I call you. What we'd like to go to is something that's much more permission-based. Initiation is on the phone device. We'd like to go to a web service model. Maybe it's through HTML5, or maybe it's through a native app. Termination is your phone number, but I'd like to use my username, maybe my email, or in fact be anonymous. So identity has created a bit of a disruptive element in this. From the network perspective, telephony today is still very much hierarchical. It's a centralized type of call processing architecture. Whereas from an innovation perspective, let's go to a distributed peer-to-peer model. And I think probably the most compelling is that typically you associated your voice service with this dedicated private line, and that private line had a one-to-one mapping and relationship with my communications, which was voice at the time. And today, what we're seeing is that with basically mobile compute, that paradigm has completely been shattered. And this has probably been where we're talking about the demise of voice, because it's really relative to the existing business model. The demise of voice isn't really real because today the network and the actual service are going to be monetized separately. So all these things really, I think, form kind of a framing for the beginning of a Moore's Law. You know, if I can actually unleash voice in communications from the rigid structure of telephony, maybe I can start to create new contexts and ways to deliver voice communication services, but we're still missing the semiconductor. We're still working with vacuum tubes in terms of how we do that, because all we're doing is recreating different walled gardens. So we're making progress, but the foundation is still TIM, but WebRTC, I think, has the potential to be the semiconductor for our industry. It has the potential to give us a trajectory much like Moore's Law, because it gives us some high degrees of abstractions, right? This is a report from Disruptive Compute, which talks about the scale amount of WebRTC endpoints that we could start to address when I've actually put those types of abstractions in a browser or in some type of framework that I can launch native applications with. And you know, we can see this moving from the billion endpoints that we have today, support over browsers, to something where I can get to 4 billion, and a one-to-one match with the type of mobile broadband devices that we see in the ecosystem today. You know, moving up to 3 billion to 4 billion in 2017. And then, despite the fact that we could get those types of endpoints activated, you can now have a multiple, or a multiplier rather, in terms of the amounts of communications that I can actually launch on top of those endpoints. And you see a number of them, and a lot of them have their DNA inside WebRTC. It's really just at the knee of the hockey stick in terms of where this can take off. So I think we're actually now on a trajectory where I can have a Moore's Law of communications, which I think is a really kind of dramatic and disruptive time in our industry. So I think that we're going to be able to unleash voice and video from the telecom structures, and I think that that's been proven out. So maybe this is more of a you know, kind of a lagging comment. But I want us to take a look at how does this actually change, you know, the dimensions in which we actually consume applications and for communications. It's this notion of a service marketplace. And you know, I have a lot of conversations with the carriers, and we talk about, you know, why do you have such an offensive relationship, I guess, with your subscribers? And it's largely because you know, you basically have to pay the subscription fee at the end of the month for all these telecom services, and it's a very rigid structure, and you don't really have the type of marketplace view that you would, for instance, if you went to a Whole Foods market, right? And I think when you look at Whole Foods and the marketplace that it offers, you know, you take a look at why am I, you know, kind of paying a 20 or 30% premium for a strip of beef because it's organic or it's antibiotic free? Why am I opening my wallet with a big smile on my face? And it's because they have this differentiation, they have this marketplace, they have a selection, they have diversity of different types of produce that I can buy. Similarly, I think we want that kind of marketplace for the way we consume communications. I don't want to just have a bunch of fruit and take it to the checkout counter and weigh it, and then that's the bulk cost I pay for my fruit. I want to pay differently for, you know, that bit of produce that was raised in, you know, the tundras of Texas or, you know, the west coast of California. I'd rather pay a premium for that. And I want to pay for it by the type of produce, not in bulk. I want to pay for things by the session. And I want to be able to have that session consumed with a different type of telecom experience that's contextual. So I think if I put all this stuff together and I take a look at where WebRTC is going and this fact that I'm taking a Moore's Law approach and that now I can start to pay by the session, have differentiation in terms of the way I consume my telecom services, that in order to really make the piece whole is that we need to connect it with a mobile first type of mentality. And here's where I think maybe we faltered somewhat as an industry. And I know that there's great reasons for why that's happened. You know, if you look at Scott Lohman's infograph from TalkBox, where they've launched a survey, they said that the #1 thing that people are asking for from WebRTC is to be able to enable it over mobile endpoints. And we've started on the first leg of that journey on the wireline, but we really need to make this something that lives natively inside a mobile environment. We're making progress towards that. Currently, what Ericsson has been doing in order to kind of stimulate that ecosystem was to release an experimental browser called Bowser. It's available on Google Play as well as the Apple App Store. But obviously, this isn't something that we're looking to sustain as a platform where you do all your browsing. It's really meant to kickstart the ecosystem. And so what we really need is to start to expand the current amount of browsers that are available over mobile operating systems. So my problem today is that client-based communications is still more about prevention when I look at it from a mobile space. And that's obviously not good if I want to create the Moore's Law effect, right? If I get WebRTC into a mobile browser or into a native environment or framework or operating system, then all those mobile endpoints become participants. And that's obviously things that drive network effects, and this is something that we should, as engineers, all be aspirant about. So what are the things that are the headwinds to getting WebRTC into the mobile endpoints? There's a lot of headwinds, and the headwinds are because mobility is hard. Now this is giving you a view of what you can see from the browser support card on the wireline side. If I look at the mobile side, the Chrome browser is coming out. Firefox and Mozilla have finally released a browser for the Android operating system. But I think we've still got some ways to go until we get ubiquity. If I look at what the quality is, even on the wireline side, it's still just good enough for jazz mode. And there's a couple of good reasons for that, from a quality perspective. And there's always a distinction. I think you'll hear a lot of people, the so-called bellheads of the industry, who will talk about quality of service, and certainly I do. I'm certainly not in a mode where I'm very didactic about the fact that everything has to be quasi-enabled, because certainly that's not true. There's a good enough, and then there's something that needs to have some quality to it. Business to business, business to consumer, versus something that's just purely consumer driven. Well, quality is important, and if we want to actually get to the tipping point of actually scaling out WebRTC endpoints, we have to worry about quality. And these are things that are multiplied in the mobile environment. Mobile application development, if you're a developer, is a Byzantine failure problem. As we all know, there's no really consistency to Byzantine failure problems. If I look at what are some of the issues and what are the challenges, the fact that if you run a video conversation off of a WebRTC application, sitting and hosted inside a mobile environment, you have to worry about the battery life, right? This thing is going to consume battery power. And I've had an issue where I've been in the middle of a conversation for not less than 5 minutes, and I have my battery power. You have to have the right processor architecture. If I take a look at what's out there, I think minimum you need to have an ARM version 7 with the Neon extension so that you can do the video acceleration, right? You have to worry about the environment. You have to worry about fallback scenarios. You have to worry about renegotiating your session context. And that needs to be as transparent as possible. If you move in an environment where inherently there's latency and jitter inside it, and that as you go into fast fade connections, you start to have to adapt now in terms of the bit rate that you're streaming across that interface, you have to worry about how that's going to impact the user experience. As many of you guys know, if you look at just something as simple as WebSockets, and you look at the amount of disconnects you get just from timeouts, right? Because there's so many different parameters that will impact a timeout in a WebSockets transport connection. You can imagine how that becomes even more untenuous under a wireless scenario where I'm actually moving between access technologies. So I think these are some things that you really have to worry about. I haven't even mentioned some of the other ones that are probably even more nefarious from a development perspective. You have different screen sizes and different resolutions you have to work. And Get User Media helps, but again, having gone through the practice of trying to implement some of these things, it doesn't work seamlessly as yet. Right? So the ecosystem is going to need some time to harden so the developers can build on solid foundations. We want to make this stuff work. So you guys are all really at the ground floor of a revolution when I think of this. Right? I think WebRTC provides solid abstraction stream media. This is the stuff that's good. And I'm going to show some of my telco color now in heritage by saying I like this, I like the abstractions from media, I like the peer-to-peer capabilities that you get from Pure Connect. But by the other side of things, it leaves out some things. And this is a good and bad situation, right? I think if you're a guy who has worked in telecoms and has worked on SS7 signaling, worked on SIP, you really feel a certain pain, an exclamation at the end of any of the proclamations around the fact that WebRTC does not provide native signaling. And of course, that's a good thing, because in some instances you don't want SIP. It's very complicated. And in fact, it's it's an awful protocol to parse, and it has difficulties running on top of WebSockets, even though that there's certainly good ways to do that. It breaks things like trickle light so that I have problems with what my connection times are going to look like. But fundamentally, there's also a degree of freedom that's afforded by not having to be locked into a signaling protocol. Identity is obviously an issue here. So identity you can put into different contexts, and certainly you can use your Facebook identity, you can use email, it could be anonymous, all those things are good. I can actually use my telecom service identifier, which is also great, but not having an identity, not having a secure find and connect, compounds things like security, because now I have all these degrees of freedom, so what is my security context? There's really strange things that are involved when you actually want to build a truly secure system. And maybe you don't need it in every instance. Maybe you have trust in the URL that you're going in order to get a conferencing capability with your favorite brand. But maybe you don't. And so what is a security context? DTLS is all right, TLS is all right, but there's other things, like being able to allow a server side to discover my local IP address. Does that expose me in any way? Are those things that I should be worried about? Right? Man-in-the-middle attacks, even though I'm dependent on that server to give me some JavaScript to actually provide a connection application, do I trust that server? What happens when I give it my credentials? What if it's attacked? These are the types of things where they're both boons, but they're also problems. I have many degrees of freedoms, but now I have many attack vectors. I don't have anything that's homogeneous necessarily, I have things that are fragmented. Fragmentation is good because I think it's axiomatic if I want to go through a Moore's law type of curve where I have many, many communications, many, many different types of endpoints. Of course it's going to be fragmented, but at the same time, homogeneity gives us great frameworks to work with in terms of being able to create robustness across these different dimensions. So how is that all going to spill out? I struggle with it, in my caveman engineer brain, but at the same time, I embrace it because I think this is where disruption is really going to start to hit. So if I look at all those things, of course, you've got some interesting pieces together. And I look at how innovation can happen against each of these vectors. And from an Ericsson perspective, we've really tried to take a look at how do I enshrine the values of what telecom is going to be in this new paradigm. And we've looked at it from how do I integrate that top end, the magic part where the signaling occurs, and the magic part for us is stuff like IMS. And we've said we want to be able to provide web access into IMS and WebRTC gateways. And of course, you guys have all heard this before. It's not new or different. But I think what we've tried to do is not just innovate on how I use IMS as a session control capability, but also how do I take the northbound side of IMS, where the applications sit, and integrate third parties, and leverage that IMS rendezvous point as a PSTN breakout, but also as an ability to integrate some of our great partners like Tropo, where we've been using them as part of our demo today to show how you can move between a mobile environment that's circuit switched, move into a WebRTC session by bridging that through the Tropo capability, and then having an enriched experience where I can augment to video. So these are the types of things that you get to do when you have all those degrees of freedom. It's stitching them all together that's really the problem. And so, just like jQuery provided the glue between browsers, we need some glue in order to create these new frameworks and ecosystems. And certainly, if you use them, you're going to be able to fill in some of the blanks that I described before. And certainly that's what we've been doing as we tried to hone what these ecosystems need to be to really provide the velocity, we think, for adoption of new applications in WebRTC. This is one of the commercial ones that are available from AT&T. I mentioned AT&T just simply because this is one of the frameworks that we're using in order to enable some of the demos that I talked about earlier. But clearly there's some great ones from Tropo, there's some great ones from TalkBox and others. We're providing open frameworks to be able to provide that glue, to provide that consistency, And these will be the ecosystems that I think that will be the engine rooms, really, of how these communications capabilities get spawned, right? Now, I guess here's the sad part. So all this cool technology, and of course I got to put my business hat on, is just that, it's technology enablers. I think it's easy sometimes for us to conflate what WebRTC is doing with, oh, well, that's just the ecosystem. And it isn't. I purposely called out players that we're using at Ericsson because ecosystem is really, really important. It's almost probably more important than some of the technology foundations for this, right? We need to have a viable app platform. And this is, I think, the piece that I'm sure a lot of the creative and smart brains around here have already cracked the code on, but I think the rest of the industry is starting to catch up, right? You can't just show up with a pretty face and get a paycheck, and that's really what the bottom of this is. I think it's one of those things when I was a developer and I moved more towards the harsh reality of commercial sunlight. It was kind of waking up. It was kind of realizing, like when you were a little kid, that bad things can happen to good people. That over arbitrarily any time scale, Keanu Reeves is probably making more money than I am. These are the things that really are daunting when you think of why can't it just be technology driven? Why do I have to look at business? But you do have to look at business. So what are we going to do to make WebRTC a viable platform? Big P platform, right? This is a great visual that was provided by Vision Mobile. And if you look at what are the things that you need to have to create a viable platform, you need to have software foundations. And that's really the dimension we're talking about. When we talk about all the stuff that's going on with W3C and an ITF, it's about creating great software foundations. And that's one part of it, right? Once you have those software foundations and you can start to create content, you need to have a developer ecosystem. People need to be able to use those APIs and build capability. They need to be able to use the frameworks that you're providing to give identity, find and connect capability, security. You need to have that developer ecosystem and people who are fluent in the language of that framework. I think we're starting in these two vectors, but there's stuff that we haven't even looked at, right? It's the monetization, it's the distribution, the retailing. This is 3 out of 5 of the things that are going to make WebRTC a platform, and we're in search of a leader here. We're looking for people to take us down this path. It's not going to be some hippie commune of I'm just going to create a bunch of cool applications unless you solve for these 3 things, unless you create an ecosystem and a platform that's viable. And I think this is where the politics in some cases comes in, and this is where some of the the unfortunate circumstances around which codec I use and other things start to manifest. But we really need to solve this. This is the stuff that'll provide the, I think the oil, if you will, to kind of drive the engine of WebRTC. So you have to remember that we're in the business of doing business. I thought I'd say that just to remind some of you. Creating a business is not easy. I think we've got a lot of the principal ingredients, right? We have strong abstractions and demand for communications. People are still talking. This is the great thing about the industry. People are still talking. And so as long as there's demand, then if you can bring the type of capabilities that allow you to basically soak up that demand, then there's opportunity, right? I think the issue now is how do I get that retailing? How do I get that monetization? How do I get that business model framing? And what I would say that is now that we've got these abstractions, these creative abstractions, we're suddenly able to do something that I've always wanted to do. I've had a good 25-year-long career in telecoms, and so I've gone through the iterations in telecoms. But in telecoms, we've always wanted an application factory. It's always been about an application factory, all the way back from Advanced Intelligent Network to IMS. It's all about creating an application factory. But the thing is that you couldn't actually create enough abstractions and whatever types of schemas that we put together that allowed me to rapidly discover new business models. So I was chained to this legacy model of telecoms. And so if I take a look at what these abstractions can deliver, they deliver me speed. And speed allows us to go through some of these lean startup concepts where I can come up with an idea, build it very quickly off of these abstractions, measure it, and then learn, put it out into the ecosystem, find out what's going on, and then reinvent that again. Do the right types of pivot so I can discover what works, and then take that and start to build scalable and, more importantly, business meaningful types of applications that'll be, I think, the center of gravity for moving the ecosystem along and creating the long tail. We need to have the short head. We need to be able to experiment quickly. This has been something that we haven't been able to do in the past. And with WebRTC, you can do that. So I think what we're seeing is the dawn of a new set of innovators to be able to rapidly scale different types of communication dimensions around WebRTC. And I think this is very exciting. So if we can get this right, we're going to be able to bring communications into the post-PC world. It's still not there, but we're getting there, right? We can put communications into context, not just in my phone. I think that's the exciting part of WebRTC. If I look at where this can go, what is the future of voice? What is the future of communications? It's not just having a phone and being able to talk through a dial-talk hang-up cycle. I can be able to embed communications into applications that I use. I can experience them in different contexts. If I have a customer relationship management capability, I can actually embed voice into it. I can use great, interesting concepts like hypervoice, which I think is something that's going to really be the tip of the spear in terms of how we consume communication services moving forward. Context brings meaning. And so I'm going to end on a soft, kind of sentimental type of feeling, but to me, it's the reason why I got into telecoms in the first place, because while context brings meaning, in the end, as an engineer, what I'm searching for is to connect people so that they can reach out with a voice conversation, a data connection, and tell the world that I'm here. I mean, as an engineer, that's the noble end game that we're all going after. So if I can bring that context, I can bring that meaning, to me, job done as an engineer. So that's my talk. Thank you. Before the thunderous applause, let me just quickly give you guys a double click on a demo that we're trialing. I talked a little bit about earlier. We're partnering with a number of different players. We're working with Tropo, Voxio. We're working with Dialogic on transcoding capability. And we're working with AT&T on some of the framework. What we've done is we've brought together some pretty interesting innovation where you can actually have a mobile session up and live, switch that to a WebRTC session off of a tablet, and then invoke and augment that conversation to go video. And then link that video to a production video presence system that's hanging off of a network-to-network interface with our IMS. I think this is really showing how you take third parties, existing telecom technologies, innovation around WebRTC endpoints, and create this dramatic new ecosystem, this dramatic new platform for innovation. So we're very excited about it. I think it helps to propel this notion of mobile first. I invite you to come to the Ericsson booth and see it for yourself. So thank you very much. That's the end of my show. Cheers.
Thanks, Vish.